we had a lot of people wanting me to do some webinars on Islam, or rather webinars on contemporary scholarship regarding Islam, and that's what I've set up here to do. And this is the first of these webinars, and let me go directly now to the second slide. This particular webinar is part one, and I'm planning a series of 7 sort of mini webinars, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But this part is concerned with my personal motivations for doing so, the contextual motivations that I think we need to discuss this subject. And I want to talk in this webinar in particular about some very good sources that you can consult and a few important points about Arabic. So let me give you an overview of what I intend to do in this particular series. As I've said, I want to do a series of 7 little mini webinars. Now, some of these are going to be short and some rather longer, and the reason I've broken them up into these 7 webinars is because I think it would be easier for you, the members, to have, rather than one very long webinar, a bunch of short ones that you can consult and go back and look up particular points if you should want to do so. So these are going to be in varying lengths. Some of them will be rather short, some of them will be rather long and considered. So I think this will be easier for you to manage all the information that I hope to present. And I want to stress the fact that when I present this information, I am presenting it so that you can basically go out and study more on your own. So what I'm doing is giving you a very high overview, not only of what Islam claims for itself, its theology, its historical narrative, but also, much more importantly, more recent contemporary scholarship concerning Islam. So I've divided it into these 7 webinars, and as I say, this is the first webinar. This will be concerning my motivation, the contextual motivation, some sources that I want to bring to your attention. If you want to investigate further, these I think are very good sources for you to consider. And then a couple of small important points about Arabic. The second webinar will be on the standard Muslim narrative and the pillars of Islamic theology. Now, this will be an important one, because if you don't know what Islam says about itself, you're not really going to be able to appreciate the significant blows that have been levied against it by scholarship. Some of it, incidentally, coming from Muslims themselves, and we'll be investigating that in a few minutes when we get to the sources that I'm going to be using in these webinars. Now, the pillars of Islamic theology are related, as all 3 historic monotheistic religions are related to the historical claims of the religion. So in other words, Islam, like Judaism and Christianity, has a theology that is salvation history. In other words, this is a technical term within theology for religions that claim certain crucial events as part of their founding mythos, and also as part of their theology of salvation, their theology of God and sin and deliverance and so on. So in this respect, Islam has essentially, as we're going to discover, 3 basic pillars or sources of theology. And of course, the first is the Quran itself. The second is very, very important, and it's something that most Westerners do not really consider when they think of Islam, and that's what's called the Hadith, Hadith. The Hadith are collections and stories of sayings or events of how each verse of the Quran was revealed to Muhammad, according to the Muslim narrative, in specific circumstances, all right? And that implies something about the Quran itself, as we're going to see. The third pillar then becomes the Sirah, or life of Muhammad itself. And out of all 3 of these things, a consensus is built up. Muslim scholars are very big on the idea of consensus of exegesis, or consensus of interpretation of the Quran. And in this, we're also going to see that there is a fundamental problem posed by the historical narrative, the Muslim standard narrative of how the religion arose, the life of Muhammad, and so on and so forth. And this concerns what we're going to call the theology of abrogation. And this will become a very, very crucial point in our exploration, our quick survey, our quick overview of the religion itself. The third webinar is going to be on archaeological historical critiques of that standard narrative. And in this respect, we're going to be looking at two very, very different areas, each of which, in my opinion, deals some very, very heavy blows against that standard narrative and the life of Muhammad. The first is concerning the idea that the religion arose in part because of Mecca's role as the center of a trading empire. And then secondly, we're going to be looking at numismatic evidence, or actual money. As we've seen so many times, religion and money are tied together. So we're going to be looking at what coins can tell us possibly about the early origins of Islam. Now, the fourth webinar is probably going to be the most extended and probably the most information rich, because in that webinar we're going to be looking at Quranic and Hadithic criticism and critique. In other words, we're going to be looking at scholarship of the Quran and the Hadith, the traditions themselves. And in that respect, we're going to be looking at early and medieval external critiques. In other words, if Islam is a historical religion and has historical claims, as it certainly does, then we should see other people responding to those claims, and what they say has a great deal of significance in this respect. We're going to be looking then at medieval approaches, modern approaches. We will look at some arguments from Muslims themselves and counter arguments from scholars. We're going to be looking briefly again at the idea of Meccan and Medinan verses in the Quran and at the theology of abrogation. Then fifthly, we're going to look very briefly at the Sirah, the life of Muhammad itself, and questions that have risen more recently in scholarship concerning the question of whether the person of Muhammad, as is portrayed by Muslim orthodoxy, even existed at all. Now, this question is related, pardon me, as we're going to see, to the Arabic language itself and some peculiarities about Arabic that we're going to get to in this very first lecture. So tune that one in. Remember that all of these webinars, just like my books, they're all kind of interrelated to each other. So it might be necessary after viewing one webinar to go back and refresh your memory with some things that have been said in other webinars on this particular topic. Then sixthly, and another very important area here, we're going to be doing some theological and philosophical critique, particularly of the idea that the Quran is an eternal book. In other words, it's co-eternal with Allah himself. And that raises certain interesting questions about the claim that Allah is the sole God and that there's absolutely no one else. We're going to be looking also at the ideas of the nation of Islam versus the nation of war in Islam. We're going to be looking at the idea of jihad and the argument that's often offered by Muslim apologists that this is simply a moral struggle that's meant. And then we're going to be looking very closely at a key piece of evidence that's right there in the Dome of the Rock itself in Jerusalem. This is a crucial structure with crucial information about the early history of Islam. And some of this might surprise some of you if you're not familiar with the inscriptions in the Dome of the Rock. And then finally, in the last webinar, I want to talk briefly about American unipolarism, political correctness, the Treaty of Westphalia, and the idea of the nation of war within Islamic theology itself. All right. So that's a kind of high overview of what we're going to be discussing in these webinars on Islam. Now, this particular webinar, as I've said, is concerning itself with personal and contextual motivations for doing this webinar in the first place. Many of you have expressed an interest in me commenting on this particular topic. I want in this webinar to talk about some important sources to bring these to your attention if you decide that you want to look more fully into this particular subject and some of the more recent scholarship about it. And I want to say a few things, a few brief things about the Arabic language itself. So in this particular webinar, I'm going to be discussing the following 6 points. Firstly, you've heard me often say radical Islam. So I need to clarify what I mean when I say radical Islam, because you'll hear this term being more and more used by Western politicians, particularly on the left, when they try to distinguish radical Islam from run-of-the-mill Islam. And I mean something very different from what they mean by it. Then we're going to be talking about briefly the geopolitical context, because this forms quite a great deal of the contextual motivation for these webinars, as most of you are aware. The third thing I want to talk briefly about are some personal motivations and some contextual motivations of a different sort. I wanted to do this because we need some clarity in the discussion. We need to distinguish between the fact that we're dealing with 1 billion Muslims who are not all clamoring to get on our shores and chop off our heads, versus state-sponsored terrorism and the press portrayal of all of this. We do need to bring some fine points of distinction, and I don't think this can be done without some basic knowledge of the religion itself, of its claims, of its theology. And then secondly, of course, all of this to be done within the context of an Islamic history in recent critical scholarship, because as I've indicated, critical scholarship has been laying some very heavy blows against the claims of the historical narrative of Muslim orthodoxy itself. Then fourthly, I want to look back at what Dr. DeHart and I said about Jan Assmann, the Egyptologist, and the Yahwist tradition in our book, Yahweh, the Two-Faced God. As we're going to see, if you look at the broad history of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, what you see emerging here is a pattern of secondary, then tertiary, and then finally quaternary religions. And I'll explain what I mean here by these terms in a moment. Fifthly, in this webinar, this brief webinar, I want to look a little bit at the Arabic language and a personal note about my experience with the Arabic language due to my exposure to Eastern Orthodoxy for about 20 years. And even though I'm not an Arabic speaker or specialist by any stretch of the imagination, there are a couple of key crucial points here that I want to bring to your attention that are going to form crucial points in the arguments in the webinars that follow this one. And then finally, in this webinar, most importantly, I want to expose you to some of the sources that I will be using. And these sources, I want to stress, have established themselves in the scholarly community, if not necessarily as being classical studies of particular topics, then certainly studies that, when combined together with other similar studies, present a very, very different picture of the theology and the history of Islam and then Islamic claims themselves. So consider these webinars, in essence, a kind of review of scholarly literature that's out there, and an attempt to kind of synthesize some of these ideas together in one coherent picture. Now, with that in mind, let's go to our first point. What do I mean when I say radical Islam? Well, what I mean by that is that Islam itself, not necessarily all Muslims, but rather the religion itself, in its fundamental historical narrative, its claims about that narrative, and then the theology that's built upon it, is indeed a radical religion. It is an unreconstructed, unreformed, and unenlightened religion. Now, what do I mean by those terms? Well, again, my perspective here, or the context in which I'm making these remarks, is by way of comparison to what happened to the history of Christianity in the West. And again, please understand, I'm stressing Western Christianity, not Eastern Christianity. In the West, you had eventually the Protestant Reformation, which challenged, ultimately semi-successfully, challenged the papal claims and the absolute nature of those claims. And this led, of course, to the Catholic Counter-Reformation, which in a certain sense kind of did the same thing, all right? And this led ultimately to the early Enlightenment in Europe, when you found the philosophical foundations for the rise of the modern secular state. Now, Islam has had no similar mass movements of reform or enlightenment. Now, this will become clearer once we get into these webinars, when we examine the pillars of Islamic theology, and especially the idea of the theology of abrogation and their relationship to that standard narrative, the orthodox history as Islam itself presents its own origins. So this is a key point. Now, again, I want to stress that this does not mean that there are Muslims who are unaware of these points. And in fact, some of the sources I'm going to point you to are indeed sources from Muslims themselves, or rather from former Muslims, looking at their own religion and deciding that, well, we just can't do this if we're going to live in the modern world. All right, so with that in mind, what I mean by radical Islam, I really mean to say simply Islam, because it is a radical religion in this sense. It has had no parallel movement of internal reform or of internal enlightenment, such as we saw in Western Europe. Pardon me. And this is the fundamental problem that we're dealing with. So when I say this, it's very, very different from what you hear on television now, television commentators, or even politicians when they say radical Islam, because they're trying to present the picture that the radicals are acting in an un-Islamic way rather than in a traditional Islamic way. Now, I think perhaps that part of this is because this is in itself a political psyop done by the Western politicians in order to send messages to the world of Islam that, yes, we really know what your religion stands for and you're going to have to reform it, all right? Now, with that in mind, let's go then to the geopolitical context, the geopolitical motivation for these webinars. And I think here there are 4 basic points to why I personally think that we all need to be at least somewhat aware of the basic outlines of Muslim claims, the Muslim history itself as it understands it, and its own theology about it, and then responses to it. Now, the first of these is, obviously, as I pointed out, as we all know, we don't have a billion-plus Muslims all trying to storm our shores and take off our heads and convert the entire world to Islam. In fact, there is, as a percentage of the population that would be considered radical, it's something like 30 million to 1 billion, according to the more liberal estimates. But this means that state-sponsored terrorism, as we've seen in the news lately, has been a major component of this radical jihadist element that we've seen active on the world stage. And we can think in particular of nations like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and then of course Iran, having all ties to some aspects of this movement, and having enacted within their own states, trying to enact in Islamic law in its totality. And we've seen what has resulted in those nations. So we don't need to rehearse some of the barbarity associated with those regimes here. The second point, however, in this geopolitical context is we need to understand something about the difference between Shia and Sunni Muslims and Shia and Sunni Islam, because this split is really a split over the succession of authority from Muhammad. And that is a key point. And the Muslim world has been basically at war over this almost since its inception. So this becomes a very important thing to understand when you consider Shia nations like Iran, and Sunni nations like Saudi Arabia, and why they are at such loggerheads with each other. And within that context, then, we need to understand the significance of any Islamic nation getting the bomb, because they are as likely to use this against their opponent within the world of Islam as they are against the West. So that's a consideration that you need to understand, and to understand it, then you have to know something about the history and theology of Islam. Now, the final thing that obviously enters our considerations, our motivations for talking about this, is the radical Islamicists themselves versus the secular Islamic states, because my thesis here, given my definition of what I mean by radical Islam, is simply that the Islamicists are not really radical. They are simply practicing their religion as their religion itself, in its unreconstructed, unreformed, unenlightened theology itself dictates should be practiced. It is the rest of the Muslim world, the vast majority, in other words, of the Muslim world, that is not living according to Islamic tenets. So in other words, the secular Islamic states can be viewed, in my view, in a certain sense, as being nations that have attempted to enact this reform more or less on a nation-by-nation basis. Now, this means, I think, the key thing here for us and for our purposes, this means that a true reform, a true enlightenment, has to be a pan-Islamic phenomenon. And this can only occur by making the scholarly critiques of the narrative of Islam and of the theology built on that narrative more popularly available. Now, there's a certain hypocrisy in this respect that we've seen emerge in the Western press, and more recently in political debates in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and elsewhere in the Western world. And this is the attempt, as I've indicated, by the Western press and politicians to characterize jihadist Islam as somehow an aberration from the tenets of the religion itself, which are more or less peaceful. This, as we shall see, is in direct contradiction to the Muslim narrative of its own origins. So in other words, again, the radical Islamicists are simply practicing their religion. It is the religion itself that they're practicing and that is leading to this violence. So we need to make this very clear. In order to have an informed understanding, we must understand that narrative as the Muslim religion itself teaches it, and then we have to understand the theology of abrogation and the difference between the Meccan verses of the Quran and the Medinan verses of the Quran. All right, and we'll get into all of that subsequently. Now, the way we can avoid falling between the skilla of painting all Muslims as radical jihadists on the one hand, which they're not, and falling into the trap of the Western leftist press, which refuses to deal with these issues in any sense, because to deal with them, you see, opens up that inherent prejudice against anything theological. So if they want to deal with Muslim theology, they're going to have to deal with Jewish theology and Christian theology and so on and so forth. So by pointing to scholarly critiques of all of this, I'm really hoping to point out a way that can avoid both pitfalls and put it on a more scholarly basis for discussion, and ultimately, I hope, for a kind of war of words, a cultural critique, if you will, or a cultural war of words, rather than a cultural war of bombs, which none of us, I don't think, wants. So what I'm trying to do here is add some clarity to the discussion, because we have to distinguish 1 billion Muslims versus the state-sponsored terrorism that we've seen emerge in the Western press versus the Western press's portrayal of all of this. And in each case, we're dealing with falsehoods, all right? As I've said, the religion itself, the system itself, is behind jihadism. And there are specific reasons for this. And we're going to examine this in terms of Islamic history in recent critical and historical scholarship. I get asked the question many times that Islam had a golden age. And if the religion was so bad, then why did it have a golden age? Well, my answer, I think, is going to shock you, because the answer concerns the emergence of the Muslim orthodoxy itself. Because as we're going to see, Islam, it appears, begins as a Christian aberration and then transforms into Mohammedism, into its current form, as a political tool under the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates, all right? And that's precisely during the period of the codification of the Quran itself. So in other words, this is a key point that you have to understand. Western scholarship is challenging the whole narrative of the history of Islam as Muslims understand it. And there's a whole body of scholarship, if you're familiar with it, once you're familiar with it, that can be used to transform this into the hot war of bullets and bombs into an extended cultural critique. And this is really what's needed. So with that in mind, let's look back for a moment at the Egyptologist Jan Assmann and the comparative mythologist Joseph Campbell and the Yahwist tradition that Dr. DeHart and I discussed in our book, Yahweh, the Two-Faced God. And in this respect, I want you to think of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, in a certain sense, as secondary, tertiary, and quaternary religions. Now let's go back to Yahweh, the Two-Faced God, on page 27, where we quoted Jan Assmann, and here we go. Quote, as Jan Assmann observes, Yahwism, quote, relates the story of its own establishment as a history of violence punctuated by a series of massacres, unquote. Now let me stop right there, because as we're going to see, this is the exact same pattern that we see in the standard Muslim narrative of its own historical origins under the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century. All right. So in other words, it's in this sense firmly within the Yahwist tradition. Now let me continue with what we wrote in Yahweh, the Two-Faced God. Yahwist monotheism thus presents at the outset a moral incongruity, a moral schizophrenia. Quote, monotheism is theoclasm. That is how it perceives itself. We would be better off reflecting on how to come to terms with this semantics of violence, rather than sweeping it under the carpet in our eagerness to extol monotheism as the religion of a universal brotherly love. Monotheism, in other words, is aware of its inherent violence and emphasizes the revolutionary shift that its consequential introduction brings about, unquote, unquote. And again, that's from Yahweh, the Two-Faced God, page 27. And we're citing Jan Assmann, the Egyptologist, from his book, The Price of Monotheism, on pages 21 and 27. Now, let's go to the next, set of quotations that I want to bring back to your attention, back to your memory. And this, again, is from our book, Yahweh, the Two-Faced God. All counter-religions base themselves on large bodies of canonical texts. First of all, counter-religions or secondary religions appear in textual space, that is, in the form of textual articulation and scriptural tradition as a specific kind of collective memory based on ritually structured textual architectures. And bear that phrase in mind, because as you're going to see in these webinars, this is particularly true of Islam. These textual architectures are inherited and kept alive by means of elaborate techniques and institutions of interpretation. The distinction between primary and secondary religions always appears as the distinction between nature and scripture, unquote. Now, I want to stop again and highlight once again, to stress once again, that this is particularly true of Islam. And it's right here, I think, that you have an ultimate explanation as to why the religion, after a brief golden age, stagnates and isn't able to produce or to maintain technological pace with the West. Even during the fall of Constantinople in 1453 to the Muslim Turks, the Turks had to buy their cannon from, well, guess who? From the West, from Venice, all right? So in other words, even there, the technological capability exhibited by the Turks really didn't come from within the culture itself, in spite of its previous golden age, all right? And we have to ask ourselves, well, then why did the culture stagnate after that brief golden age so quickly? Now let's continue with this quotation from Yahweh the Two-Faced God, citing Joseph Campbell, the comparative mythologist. Quote, "The type of scholarship characteristic of both of the synagogue and the mosque, therefore, where the meticulous search for the last grain of meaning in Scripture is honored above all science, never carried the Greeks away. In the great Levantine traditions, such scholasticism is paramount and stands opposed to the science of the Greeks. For if the phenomenal world studied by science is but a function of the will of God, and God's will is subject to change, what good can there possibly be in the study of nature? The whole knowledge of the first world principle, namely the will of God, has been by the mercy of God made known to man in the book that he has furnished." And this, again, my friends, is particularly true in a very fundamental way, in a way that is, in Islam, almost different to a certain extent from Judaism and Christianity. And we're going to see why in one of these webinars coming up. But the emphasis within Islam on the book is crucial, on the Quran, and therefore on its tradition of interpretation, the Hadith, and the relationship it has with the life of Muhammad, the Sirah, all right? So Campbell concludes, "Ergo, read, read, read. Bury your nose in its blessed pages and let pagans kiss their fingers at the moon," unquote. And again, that's from Yahweh the Two-Faced God, page 32. And we're citing Joseph Campbell, The Masks of Gods, Occidental Mythology, Penguin, 1991, pages 180 to 181. Now let's look at that for a moment. Because as I've indicated, what this tends to mean is that what we're faced with the historical monotheisms, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are first of all with a secondary religion, Judaism, opposed to a religion or a world of nature that it's escaping when it flees Egypt. You recall all of that from Yahweh the Two-Faced God. So in other words, it introduces, as we pointed out in that book, it introduces a social schism, a religious schism into the social space of the ancient world. Because everything outside of the religion, everything outside of the revelation contained in the book, is now suspect and ultimately idolatrous. And this means also that everything that preceded it, it's a schism in time, it's a schism in history, is also suspect and idolatrous. So, to a certain extent, the secondary religion requires the existence of that primary religion because it defines itself to a certain extent in opposition to it. Now, this means that when Christianity comes along, it views itself as a new covenant, a new testament, a new shaping, if you will, of that secondary religion. So this means that there is, to a certain extent, an implicit structure of dialectical opposition, not only to the world of nature, but also to the religion that preceded it, which it now claims it is a fulfillment of, and that is Judaism. But there's a caveat here, and it's an important one, and you have to remember this. In Christianity, the fascination isn't a book, it's a person. The Word was made flesh, dwelt among us, and so on and so forth, from the beginning of the Gospel of St. John. So in other words, for the early Christian church, it's not so much a book or a leather-covered Bible. It's the person that text reveals. And it's not the only text revealing it. For the early Christians, it's much more a revelation that is concerned with a common liturgical or ritual life experience of that person, of which the scripture is a component. All right, so there is this caveat in Christianity. There's a softening to a certain extent of this emphasis on the book. All right, now I'm saying that because that's a kind of a general overview of things that are so complicated that we can't get into. But I will say that that emphasis continues sort of with a certain degree of strength within Eastern Christianity. It changes in Western Christianity to an increasing emphasis on the book, so that by the time you get to the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation, what do you see? Well, you see the re-emergence of the emphasis on the book in the Protestant sola scriptura, or only the scripture, versus the Roman Catholic scripture and tradition itself is embodied in what? Well, a bunch of books. Okay, so you do see this initial softening begin itself to soften and re-harden into an emphasis on the book. All right, and then finally you have the quaternary religion, which is Islam, which, if you read the Quran, there are references, there are biblical references, there are references to Judaism, there are references to Christianity, and Islam itself is defining itself as the final revelation in opposition to the previous two, and ultimately in opposition to the classical religions or philosophies of nature. So in other words, it's a quaternary religion, dependent and to a certain extent defining itself in opposition to everything that preceded it. All right. Now, with that in mind, let me turn to yet another very important point, and this is kind of a personal note on Arabic. All right. I do not know Arabic. I am not an Arabic scholar. This is a language that in my studies I never had to expose myself to in any detailed way other than in the most rudimentary fashion. However, I should point out that my conversion to Orthodoxy occurred in a Syrian, that is to say, an Arab jurisdiction Orthodox church, not a Greek church or a Russian church. After I was converted in the Syrian church, I eventually gravitated to the Russian church, which is like transferring from the Episcopal Church in the United States to the Church of England in Great Britain. It's all one church, but there are different jurisdictional hierarchies within it. So I did have exposure to Arab Christians and therefore to the use of liturgical Arabic. And I put up a very interesting prayer on your screen there that it would be very familiar to Eastern Orthodox Christians, particularly Arab-speaking Christians. And this is a little prayer called the Trisagion in Greek, or the Thrice Holy in English. And in Arabic it is Kudusan Allah, Kudusan il-Qawi, Kudusan Aladi la Yamuteramna. All right? Now, I said that prayer many, many times in my early years as an Orthodox Christian, going to a Syrian Orthodox church. I heard Arabic hymns all the time. Hearing Allah in Christian prayers didn't bother me, because Arabic, the word Allah means simply God. All right. So in other words, there's no peculiarly Muslim thing about the term Allah. It's simply the Arabic term for God. Now, that said, it is true that Islam gives a unique character to Allah. And we're going to be talking about that in some of these webinars on down the line. But the term Allah is not, therefore, a proper name. It's not like the term Jesus Christ, naming an individual deity. It is simply the Arabic term for God. All right. Now, with that in mind, let's turn to the term Muhammad, because Muhammad simply means the praised one. And as we're going to see, this means that there's a fundamental ambiguity, particularly when you encounter this term in early Arabic and It's Syriac cognates that precede it. All right. The term Muhammad is therefore either a titular or honorific title that can be used of anyone who might be called the praised one, or as it becomes later, it can mean a proper name referring to an individual. We encounter individuals named Muhammad all the time, okay? So this means that there's a fundamental ambiguity to the term in its early stages that you're going to have to pay attention to when we start examining some of the texts that we're going to examine in these webinars. Now, finally, let's talk about further motivations. Why am I referring to certain sources in these webinars, to certain resources? Well, I have here basically 5 goals. I first of all want to acquaint you with the latest or reigning scholarly critiques of the Islamic narrative, of its own history, and to a certain extent, to a very limited extent, as we're going to see, to Quranic criticism where possible. This will be particularly true when we get around to examining the verses on the inside of the Dome of the Rock, all right? This is going to be a very crucial component of what we're going to examine. And secondly, I want to acquaint members with the best popular collections out there, scholarly collections, and less scholarly, for your own further study, if you should want to do it. And thirdly, I want to create the conditions for informed discussion, all right? And by informed, that means we're going to have to understand that the political correctness narrative, that this is not really the religion itself doing these things, these are simply a bunch of radical nuts. Well, no, these are people that are taking the tenets of their religion very seriously, and that's the fundamental problem. But that said, once we get into the critique of the religion, once we see the hammer blows that have been laid to the narrative itself, to the narrative trunk, then we'll be in a position gradually over time, with enough people being informed about this, to challenge this. And in that challenge, hopefully to encourage those vast majority of Muslims themselves to speak out and understand that they themselves are being taken on a ride by a bunch of radicals, all right? So I want to create the conditions for informed discussion. And obviously, the fourth thing I want to do is to change the politically correct whitewash, because it does not, in the long term, serve anyone's interest to shortchange or to paper over or to whitewash the fundamental tenets that the jihadists are citing. All right. So in other words, we have to knock the props out from that theology. And again, the theology is based on what? It's based on, like the other 2 monotheisms, it's based on a historical narrative. So if you want to knock the theology out, you have to knock the historical prop out from underneath it. And then finally, I want to contribute to the creation of a context, a cultural context, that will ultimately drive a cultural reform or enlightenment within Islam by Muslims themselves. And in this respect, as we're going to see in just a few seconds, Muslims or former Muslims have understood the dangers inherent in this system and have been leading the way in many cases to try and change the internal structure and tenets of the religion. And this, as we're going to see, is going to be particularly important when we consult the historical basis for the theology of abrogation and how that can be changed, all right? So with that in mind, let's end this first webinar by looking at 5 of the very most important sources that you can turn to understand what's going on in the realm of Islamic historical scholarship and critique, all right? The first book that I want to bring to your attention is this popularizing book that basically is a summary of many scholarly studies of Islam. This is kind of a Baedeker's guide to Islamic scholarship. If you're familiar in Europe with the Baedeker roadmap guides of Europe, this would be the Baedeker of Islamic Studies. All right, this is a book by Robert Spencer. Did Muhammad exist? And the question itself shows you how fundamental and sweeping some of the critique of the historical claims of Islam have already become in the hands of scholarship over the last 100 or so years. Subtitle of this is An Inquiry into Islam's Obscure Origins. This was published in Wilmington, Delaware by ISI Books in the year 2012. This is an excellent introduction, and to a certain extent, I've framed these webinars around the same type of argumentative scaffolding that Spencer pursues in his book, although not exclusively, as we're going to see, because I do refer and use some important input from other critiques as well. Now, the second book that is crucial here, as really there are a number of books by this particular author. His name is Ibn Warraq. That should be spelled W-A-R-R-A-Q. I think I hit a G there when I was typing. This is a pseudonym because Ibn Warraq is a former Muslim who left the religion having done a critical examination of it and compared it to Western society and just found the whole thing lacking. So he left the religion entirely. But he's also been active in editing, in publishing his own essays, editing other scholarly journals and articles about Islam. He's a crucial fellow to get to know in these studies. He's done a number of books. They're all excellent. They're all thoroughly scholarly, and he is laying the axe, so to speak, to the root and branch to the whole structure. This is one of the more important books that you might want to consult. We will be using and referring to this book at various points in these webinars. It's called Virgins, What Virgins, and Other Essays. This is published in Amherst, New York by Prometheus Books in the year 2010. The ISBN is 978-1-61614-170-7. Again, he's an important editor of critical Islamic studies. He's a former Muslim, and incidentally, he's writing under a pseudonym, as many of these scholars do, because they have been given death threats by, guess who? The practitioners of the religion of peace and brotherhood. All right? Now, the second book that's very important is also another book by Ibn Warraq. This is called The Quest for the Historical Muhammad, again, published in Amherst, New York by Prometheus Books in the year 2000. Prophetically enough, not to coin a pun, about a year before 9/11. ISBN here is 1-57392-787-2. Now, you'll notice that he is the editor and translator. This book is an important collection of scholarly articles and essays by various Muslim scholars, Islamic scholars, going all the way back to Renan in France in the 19th century, to the famous Jesuit Islamic scholar Lamens, and so on and so forth. Another important book. It's kind of a collection of essential tools and scholarly articles, again, edited by Ibn Warraq. Now, this is a crucial study, an anthology. I will be referring to one of the articles contained in this anthology in an upcoming webinar dealing with numismatic evidence from the early period of Islam. This is edited by Karl-Heinz Ohlich and Gert Pouin. It's entitled The Hidden Origins of Islam, New Research into Its Early History, again published by Amherst, at Amherst, New York by Prometheus Books in the year 2010. ISBN is 978-1-59102-634-1. Pardon me. This is a collection of thoroughly scholarly and technical reviews of various archaeological evidences coming from the early history of Islam. And as we're going to see, the numismatic evidences, the coins that were issued by early Arab leaders is far removed from what you would expect from the standard narrative. And this is a key component of evidence in the emerging synthetic history of Islam. Now, the final book here that I want to bring to your attention is this book here, Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam by Dr. Patricia Crone. Now, this book, again, was published by Gorgias Press in 2004, ISBN 1-59333-102-9. This is a reprint of the book that Dr. Crone published at Princeton University in 1987. This is an extraordinarily technical and scholarly book, but it takes direct aim at the claim of the standard narrative of Islamic tradition that Islam was tied to trade flowing through the city of Mecca. Now, the reason that this book, in spite of its intensely scholarly nature, is so very important in contemporary Islamic studies is that she subjects that whole tradition to a thorough analysis and critique, and that the conclusions that she reaches, and we're going to see these in upcoming webinars, are so sweeping and highly challenging to the Islamic tradition, to the hadith, in other words, of its own history, that this is yet another hammer blow. This is an absolutely crucial, critical work. Now, there's many others that we're going to encounter once we get into this series of webinars a little bit more. There are some scholarly books that also redid the entire thinking about the origins of Islam. I'm thinking particularly in terms of the scholar Waynesboro. But all of these things, when you put them together, when you synthesize all of these technical articles, what you see emerging of the early history of Islam is, as I've suggested before, an early Christian aberration, which then was transformed into the modern Mohammedan religion that we see. All right, and we're going to get into that subsequently in this webinar. Now, the final thing that I want to bring to your attention, a couple of more sources that are very, very crucial, although we are not going to be referring to them extensively, are again two collections, anthologies of scholarly articles, again edited by Ibn Warraq. The first being What the Quran Really Says, subtitle Language, Text, and Commentary. This was again published at Amherst, New York by Prometheus Books in 2012. ISBN 978-157-392-9455. And then the second anthology, again edited by Ibn Warraq, is Which Quran? Variants, Manuscripts, and Linguistics. And again, published by Amherst, at Amherst, New York by Prometheus Books in the year 2011. ISBN 978-159-102-4293. These two books go extensively into manuscript variations of the Quran, into the differences between the early Arabic and later Arabic script, where the script, like Hebrew, underwent vowel pointing and diacritical marks and therefore underwent possible mistranslation, and so on and so forth. So the same types of arguments are being leveled at the Quran that were leveled by critical scholars at the texts of the Bible, and particularly the New Testament and Christianity. I would say that in terms of Quranic criticism, again, I don't know Arabic, so in reading these two books, much of the technical points were lost on me. But if you do know Arabic, these would be two very good books to read. But even still, even if you don't know it, they're very, very helpful just to understand the complexity of arguments that are out there concerning the variations in the Quranic text itself. So with that in mind, this is the end of our first little webinar. We've got about 6 to go now, and this is Dr. Joseph P. Farrell. I hope you found this profitable and to a degree enlightening. And that's it. We'll see you on the flip side.